Chair, and it's with much disappointment that I rise to take a call on part 2 of this bill, and in particular with reference to the SOP in the name of the Honourable Jerry Brownlee, SOP number 347, where once again we find the national government removing the ability for New Zealanders to have their say in consenting processes surrounding oil and gas exploration, once again watering down environmental protections, and once again not doing it through the regular process of this Parliament, which would have seen a select committee procedure, which would have seen debate and submissions on the particular amendments in the SOP, but rather dumping it into the House during the committee stage on a completely different piece of legislation. Because this actually amends the exclusive economic zone legislation which was passed last year. And here we have in the marine legislation, and a piece of legislation that was actually primarily amending the Maritime Transport Act, what we find is that we are amending another piece of legislation to undo changes that were promised would not be made at the time. Because what this SOP does in Clause 89 is it takes the 3 classifications of marine consents which are currently permitted, discretionary and prohibited. So permitted is allowed to happen, doesn't have to go through a big process. Prohibited obviously can't happen at all, so there is no process. And discretionary is where the bulk of the exclusive economic zone legislation detail lay, because that's the process through which a company could apply to carry out an economic activity in the exclusive economic zone. The EPA would run a marine consent process. Now, we were critical of that process when that bill went through Parliament for a number of reasons, not least of all being that there was no ability of appeal, as there is under the RMA. There was only the ability to appeal on points of law, not points of substance. But at least there was a process within that exclusive economic zone legislation for the public, for environmental organisations, for geotechnical experts, for industry experts to have their say and their input into whether or not that marine consent should be granted. And at the time, there was a lot of public concern that the exclusive economic zone legislation was far weaker, far more permissive than the Resource Management Act, which applies out to 12 nautical miles, and then beyond that the exclusive economic zone legislation governs all that activity. And Labor raised serious questions as to why you would have 2 completely different regimes regulating exactly the same activity, operating side by side. And the answer to that question, as one of the submitters during the Select Committee process on the EEZ bill told us, was because it was deliberately more permissive, because it was deliberately going to allow activities to go ahead that possibly would not have been consented under the Resource Management Act because of the risk factors involved when it comes to environmental protection. So there's deep concern about this particular piece of legislation. But whenever these concerns were raised, the then Minister of Energy, Phil Heatley, would reassure communities, and he went to Kaikoura and he reassured that community there, because they're very concerned about the impact of oil and gas exploration on their whale watching tourism economic activities down. They're very, very concerned. And Phil Heatley said to them, "I promise you that there will be a process within the marine consenting process where you can have your say on any application for oil and gas exploration in the exclusive economic zone." That was a promise that the national government made when that legislation was going through Parliament. That was the reason they gave for disregarding all the other concerns that were being raised about the legislation, concerns about how permissive it was, concerns about the lack of environmental protection, concerns about taking away appeal rights on points of substance. All these concerns were to be addressed by the fact that the public would be allowed to have their say through the consenting process. So here we are, not a year later, with an amendment that removes that right, with an amendment that now says we're not going to just have the categories of permitted, discretionary and prohibited activities. We're going to introduce a new definition for a non-notified discretionary activity. So this is a discretionary activity where the public won't get to have their say, and the Minister has already indicated that oil and gas exploration for the drilling of exploratory wells is going to be a non-notified discretionary activity. Well, the Gulf of Mexico disaster wasn't an exploratory well. This is not, Mr Chair. Mr Chair.
Moana Meki.
Thank you, Mr Chair. This is not a low-risk activity, as the Minister has tried to claim. She said, oh, it'll happen over the course of about 6 weeks. You know, it's fairly low risk. Well, tell that to the people who had to deal with the Deepwater Horizon event in the Gulf of Mexico, which was in an exploratory well and in one that was in shallower water than some of the applications that are currently being considered, and in much shallower water than the waters in many of the most recent block offer for 2014. And the Minister's response to that then was, oh, well, we write legislation for what should happen, not what does happen. So it's all very well. So basically she's saying nothing can ever go wrong, so I'm writing legislation on the basis that it will never go wrong and ignoring the fact that it does sometimes go wrong. And on this side of the House we think that actually the legislation and the regulation should be robust enough to ensure that all those protections are in place. And a part of that is very, very much that public input process. And it's not just the public who input during that. It is geotechnical experts, it is environmental experts, it is people from industry who aren't currently connected but who want to have their say, people who have experience in the oil and gas industry, people who know a lot more than the collective wisdom of even this Parliament because of their own experiences. And why that's important is because there are real concerns around the EPA's ability to process these marine consents now completely void of any input from any outside experts or individuals or organisations. Because the EPA doesn't have an investigative capability. It doesn't have that. So how is it going to be able to now to make a crucial decision on whether or not this stuff should go ahead based on a complete lack of information from those who would be interested? And we know this because when we sit on a select committee, there is hardly ever do we get a piece of legislation that goes through without amendment after we sit down and hear submissions. That's why the select committee process is such a good one. That's why it produces good law, is because we don't have the monopoly on all the information in our Parliament or in our select committee or even in the EPA, and we get an awful lot of benefit out of that process of having people come along and submit. And I don't think there's a single member in this House who would say that the submissions on bills at select committee don't add an awful lot to the legislation and changes that are then potentially made before it comes back to the House. And this could have gone to a select committee, this change, because this decision to introduce a new non-notified discretionary classification was adopted by Cabinet on the 25th of February 2013, and this bill was reported back from select committee on the 27th of February 2013, 2 days later. So there is no reason why this couldn't have gone to a select committee. The Minister knew that this change was going to be made. Months of work would have led up to this finally going to Cabinet and being approved. All the while, this piece of legislation was sitting at Select Committee and no one was told that this was coming. Again, this is exactly what we saw with the changes to the Crown Mineral Bill, where Minister Bridges held off his protest ban SOP, held it back from the Select Committee until we'd reported back, and then threw it into the committee stage. This is exactly the same thing, exactly the same abusive process happening again, to avoid the scrutiny that comes from a proper select committee process. And the interesting link back to that protest ban under the Crown Minerals Act, that SOP, is that the Minister could have instead amended this bill, the Maritime Transport Act, to carry over the provisions that exist in our territorial waters for dealing with dangerous or reckless activity at sea out into the exclusive economic zone. So not only could he have done it under the Crown Minerals Bill and actually given it to the Select Committee, he could have done it under this piece of legislation as well, which actually governs that dangerous and reckless behaviour in our territorial waters, except what we know now from the regulatory impact statement that was finally released once Treasury forced him to put it up on the website, is that it wasn't about banning dangerous or reckless activity, it was about banning protesting, full stop. They don't want anything getting in the way of the only plan they have for regional economic development in this country. So here we are again, greasing the wheels. Here we are again, another broken promise. The National Party promised that the public would be able to have their say, and here they are taking it away in an SOP on a completely different piece of legislation that the Minister says, oh, well, you know, we alerted people to it back in April. Why wasn't the Select Committee told about it when she would have been doing the work on that Cabinet paper for the entire time that this bill was at the Select Committee over those months leading up to the reporting back on the 27th of February? And the reason is because when it comes to watering down environmental protections, when it comes to greasing the wheel for industry as much as possible, when it comes to shutting the general public out, this national government will stop at nothing.
Dr. Cam Calder.
Mr Chair, it's an absolute delight to take a short